Halo Infinite Season 2 has launched. Yes, the gears are grinding, and 343 is adding more and more into Halo Infinite's multiplayer, and they are also, importantly, going back in and fixing in long-standing issues. So that's what this video is about today, covering primarily the Xbox Series versions of this game, going over those fixes, as well as talking about new graphics and performance modes. And to talk about this, I'm joined by resident friend and colleague John Linneman, who covered this game on Xbox on release. How you doing there, John?
I'm doing wonderful, Alex, and I am encouraged by some of the changes that we're seeing here today with Halo, which is specifically why we're covering it again on the channel. Because, as you noted, I did cover the game at launch, and although I did enjoy the core gameplay a lot, actually, it plays very well. It launched with a number of performance and presentation issues, right?
For sure, yeah.
Obviously, things like cutscenes had noticeable stutter. Animation played at the incorrect rate. We saw incorrect frame rate of animations in game as well. There's things like FMVs that didn't play correctly and VRR that didn't function correctly. Things like this, where essentially it's not nearly as smooth or as polished as it should have been. And this actually applied to every platform, including the PC, unfortunately. So, Alex, I kind of thought we would jump into this by going through some of these issues, and since you've spent the most time looking at what's been fixed, perhaps you can fill in everybody as to how everything's improved, starting with the video clips.
So the game, the way it greets you after you get in the menu is by playing it at full motion video, pre-rendered content that was done in an offline renderer. And back in the day, I'm going to put these two clips side by side now, you should have been able to see right away that something didn't look right on the left-hand side. I think John and I talked about this pre-release that for one, the colors and the black levels were all wrong. You can notice that really easily if you look at the like 21:9 aspect ratio bars on the bottom of the screen, which are gray on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side now, the colors and the black levels look correct, as we're seeing on Xbox Series X here. So it looks proper now, and this is a really beautifully rendered cutscene, so to have it already like your first engagement with the game, is it looking wrong, isn't great. Another important thing, and I'm going to use PC footage for this here, that I have reference footage from back in the day, is how the original FMV, when they played it back to you, it's 30 FPS, but it never actually played at a proper 30 FPS. It was like 30 FPS with improper frame pacing and really intense improper frame pacing. I'm talking about like the worst parts of Bloodborne levels of frame pacing. And, you know, they're trying to make the Master Chief look cool. They're trying to set up Atriox as this bad dude. And it just comes back like a stuttery mess the first time you play this game. And it's been like this basically till now.
Exactly. And I think people will say, well, guys, it's just video, who cares? But I maintain that it's very important when it comes to creating that first impression, especially because before you ever touch the game, you're going to see things just like the company logos pop up. You're going to see this introduction FMV. And who knows how much money they spent on rendering this sequence out.
Probably a lot.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure it's a very expensive scene. It's key to the story. The fact that it doesn't play correctly is not good. And I think that this is something developers really should pay attention to when it comes to creating that sense of polish for your games. But of course, that was just the tip of the iceberg. The other problem, and I think I mentioned this on the Direct as well, is that the cutscenes played with incorrect animation rate. And this was especially noticeable because in many scenes you can actually move the camera around with the right stick, especially while first person. And you'll note that the game's still updating at a smooth 60 FPS, but the actual character animation is not running at that full rate, and it ends up looking very stuttery in motion. So Alex, why don't you tell us how it fares in this updated version?
So this one was immediately visible when I load up the game, even in the 60 FPS mode. I originally tried it out on PC using my reference footage that I made back in the day and just like putting them side by side. I didn't even need to do that to notice that it finally felt like a real 60 FPS. This was like really jarring when the game launched. I felt you're used to the presentation of 60 FPS looking rather flawless. Sure, it's not like 120, but it at least looks really smooth. And it was never that way at all. Like if you counted the frames of the animation, which I think Richard, you know, our colleague Richard Ledbetter did once, it's like somewhere in the 40s always. And it was just stop and go. And the acceleration of objects wasn't ever constant. It just looked like really poor. And now, as you're seeing from a lot of these side-by-sides I'm showing here, and I'm purposely slowing them down a bit so that you get a better sense of it. Even at 60 FPS, as I'm showing on PC here, the difference is quite intense in a lot of scenes, especially those with more camera movement and animation movement. This is even more important now when you're playing the game at 120 FPS, like you're seeing here on this footage from Xbox Series X. The opening cutscene when the Chief drops out the back of the Pelican with the pistol, and he's doing all these really cool things, and the music is gunning, and everything. You're like, this is Halo, this is great. It was so stunning in the up until it was so bad, and now on the right hand side you can see it's much smoother. And I wanted to point out this little difference that I showed John earlier of this grunt flying by in the background that shows off the difference incredibly. Like, it's just like stuttery, jittery mess on the left, and on the right-hand side, it's all smooth, exactly like you imagine 120 FPS to be. And I played on Xbox Series S, X, and PC up until the third mission when you get into the open world on all of them, and it was fixed for every single thing that I could find there. And I also found some other tertiary fixes just by going back and comparing footage. Like, there's these lights here when you go out in the Pelican to the open world behind Cortana here. If you look, they're like jittering everywhere in the original version, and well, now they're fixed in the latest version of the game. So for the most part, I'd say 90% of the aspects of the animation in cutscenes are now fixed up, and it's looking good.
And you say 90% because unfortunately there's still one thing that hasn't been addressed, and that is the facial animation. Where all the facial animation, and it's especially noticeable with things like the brutes with their exaggerated expressions, all of that updates at 30 frames per second. Especially when you're running at 120 FPS, it looks comically choppy when the characters are talking to you, which it's the last thing left here to fix. And it's always confused me as to what happened, because the pre-release footage, the footage that everybody was really harsh over, released in the year 2020, not the year 2000, that didn't have this problem at all.
Yeah, it's really bizarre. I really do wonder what happened there with the facial animation, because apparently they have the assets at 60 somewhere.
Exactly.
It's still 30 FPS in those aspects, which is unfortunate, but now I'd say that the general presentation of cutscenes is much increased.
I would agree. It looks so much better now, and this is one of those cases where if you've held off playing the campaign until now, I think it's actually safe to jump in and really enjoy it, because I do think these types of sequences are important to that campaign experience.
For sure.
And it looks so much better now. So good on them for fixing it.
Especially with the way they, I'd say, roll in cutscenes in this game. Usually it just switches from the Chief's perspective and you move outside his helmet, and it's supposed to be seamless, and it always never felt seamless, even though it really was from a cinematic perspective, because you'd be going like straight 60, 120 into this like juddery mess.
That's a shame, because I loved that. That was one of the best things about it, is the way they would transition directly into cutscene, and now it actually works.
The rogue AI known as Cortana is gone. She's been deleted.
That's cutscenes then, but obviously there's a lot more to talk about, including new visual modes. They've essentially renamed the quality, performance, or whatever they were called before modes, and you now get 3 options when playing on Series X or Series S. And it's as simple as labeling it 30, 60, or 120 frames per second, and each one has its own sort of profile in terms of what you can expect from resolution and overall image quality. I think we should start with the Series S version, because that one lost the 120 hertz output in the final game, but in that original beta version that we covered, it actually did run at 120 as an option, and it was pretty stable, but it's back. So, Alex, what did you find?
So the first thing you'll notice, I'd say when dropping to the 120 FPS mode, beyond the increase in temporal resolution, as in the frame rate, is the decrease in the real resolution of the game, internal resolution of the game on Series S. So Series S kind of surprised us at launch, where it was targeting 1080p as an output resolution. We originally, I think, thought it would maybe try and target 1440p, but it was never that way. It became immediately clear that this game was pretty heavy on the GPU. Yeah. So when you are trying to play the Series S version here in the 120 FPS mode, when you enable it, you'll definitely notice that if you put it side by side with the 60 and 30 FPS modes, that which are also aiming for 1080p, that it is really far below. In fact, every single shot I counted was basically always 540p or so. Internally, I say internally because we know that this game uses a form of temporal reconstruction to bring it back up to 1080p, so it looks better than a straight 540p definitely would, but it like combines with a number of aspects of the image here. The game uses variable rate shading tier 2.
I was going to say, Alex, because you said it looks better than a normal 540p
But,
image, but
yeah.
I'm actually not so sure.
I know.
And that's down to VRS, which as we found is not necessarily a great fit for low resolution rendering, is it?
No, like in some of these side-by-sides here, you can see some really insane flickering or some really intense flickering. I mean, that almost look like macro blocks that you're used to seeing compressed content over YouTube. It's not the YouTube video here.
It's like chroma subsampling, basically.
Yeah, for blues and reds and greens, for all colors.
For all colors.
For all colors. It's just not a good fit for the low internal resolution here that we're seeing on Series S in the 120 FPS mode. And like you're seeing here, my goodness, it can go so low res with that VRS. It just looks really, really chunky. That wouldn't be such a bad thing if the performance was awesome, but it's surprisingly variable. The indoor sections of the game that I tried out, the first 2 missions, run rather well. They're hitting 120 FPS pretty often, just with some sputters and bouts below 120 when things get more intense or when you move around rather rapidly. But that's not what Halo is. Halo Infinite has a lot of its gameplay in outdoor sections in that open world area, and as soon as the open world doors open, literally open, the game is running between 70 and 90 FPS near constantly. I'm not sure if this is GPU limited stuff or if it's the CPU getting hit in the open world there. It's hard for me to know. It's it's a console. It's never going to feel really smooth in the open world areas like it feels in the great indoor areas, which run rather well. So constant like 70 to 90, and it could probably dip below. And another thing I notice is that when you're just like moving around, that there can be frame time dips above the 20 millisecond line, meaning that it would actually be below 60 FPS in that one instance. Yeah. So it's not so great in the open world.
Honestly though, Alex, 70 to 90 would be perfectly acceptable if VRR worked effectively in this game, and we'll discuss that in a moment, but there's still some issues there, isn't there? But I think the advantage to using 120 FPS in Series S that I've seen, and it's the same as it was in the multiplayer test, is that it's pretty effective for multiplayer.
For sure. I tried this out, did a couple matches here, and it was pretty much really close to 120 FPS the entire time. Obviously, big team battle, the amount of people and the larger level size there and more objects will dip below when you look over long range distances and things like that. Really tightly knit, small designed maps, which are all designed around having high performance anyways, unlike the campaign, which is not. They're going to be hitting 120 FPS really well. So if you're playing on a Series S, this mode is really, really good for the multiplayer, and I'd say less effective in the single player campaign.
So that makes sense then. So that's one of the new modes. The other strange addition here that was kind of baffling actually in terms of how it performs, but on Series X you can opt to play at 30 frames per second for some reason. Obviously the natural benefit you would expect is that it would increase the resolution when DRS might have kicked in traditionally. What do you think, Alex? You did more testing on this, and
I've looked at the side-by-sides. I mean, yes, if you technically do look at it, played them back-to-back, you can see some resolution differences there between them, playing 30 versus the 60 FPS mode, which are both targeting 4K. The thing is, it's not as great as you would imagine with a lot of the content in the game. Always, the bigger difference I see is that like the VRS size changes a bit, so sometimes you can see VRS less, which is good. The problem is it's not really worth the increased resolution you're getting, because you're halving the frame rate, and in motion, on most sample and hold displays, you're losing all of that resolution anyway as soon as the camera moves, and so you're not getting the benefit of that high resolution in this game at 30 FPS. It's way better at 60. The gameplay's way better at 60.
Yeah.
And the reason also for that is because our old nemesis, John.
Oh no.
They're back.
No.
Improper frame pacing. I didn't want to play the game for this long because it was actually giving me a minor eye myopia issues because it's just like you're moving around, this really large FOV, first person, and all of a sudden most of the actions you do, especially in the open world area, induce frame pacing issues. And they're, once again, these are not small frame pacing issues. They actually can be pretty intense how often the frame pacing issue occurs. It makes this 30 FPS mode super redundant. And I think it points just issues that Halo Infinite has in general. Like I just mentioned, all forms of FPS capping in the console or PC version show frame pacing issues. So 30 FPS and 60 Hertz, like I just showed on Xbox Series X, but also like, let's say you are playing this game on a really awesome 4K 120 Hertz OLED, and you prefer the game and the way it looks with the 60 FPS cap, which I can definitely understand. Well, if you enable that 60 FPS cap on a 4K 120 Hertz screen, you actually get the super rare, I cannot even think of any other console game that does this, you get frame pacing issues at 60 FPS. And they're not small. They're like literally all the time. They're never stopping. And this makes the 60 FPS mode look worse at 120 Hertz than it does at 60 Hertz. And I find that rare for a console game.
Can't think of a time where we've actually seen this. And I think it's due to the fact that it's rare to have a game that's natively doing 120 Hertz that also has the option for 60 Hertz on a console, right? And like say the PS5's case, it only engages 120 Hertz when using certain modes, but on Xbox you can force it at the system level and everything will display in a 120 Hertz container. But in this case, it's not recommended. So if you want to play this game at 60 frames per second, I do recommend setting your Xbox to 60 Hertz output while playing Halo. Unless, of course, you want to use the 120 FPS mode. As you've pointed out before, this also ties into the VSync max frame rate issue that is noted on PC, right?
Yeah, it's still there. I mean, along with the frame capping issues, on PC that you see on Xbox, I played through the missions again, and I played through at 60 FPS using the in-game cap, and there's just still random drops that occur periodically that are only from that. They're only from the max FPS VSync bug. I've discussed this in so many other videos. I almost don't want to discuss it here. If you want to learn more about it, watch some of our other Halo content.
That's true. In my case, I ended up solving this on PC by just simply lowering the max refresh rate that I was using within the game. To something that was conservative enough that I could ensure that I was always hitting that frame rate, right?
Yeah.
So you want to make sure you match your refresh rate to the game and not use this VSync max limiter thing because it doesn't work correctly.
Use external VSync and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. But the last thing to talk about here, and this is kind of important, is the VRR issue, right? And this is something I mentioned in that original video. And as far as I know, this is possibly the only game I've tested where VRR essentially doesn't work correctly. It does activate. You will see an actual readout on your display, but its behavior is not correct. So when it starts to dip below a certain point, you will begin to notice very obvious judder and stuttering and sort of this inconsistency with the frame rate that you should never see when VRR is enabled.
Yeah, it's right here. I'm just going to show it off. I have a recording of it where I'm overlooking this plateau onto this valley below. And I know from looking at non-VRR footage like you're seeing here, that I recorded that the frame rate is like 120 in the Series X here. It's 120, and then I look and it goes down to like 110, 114. These are very small drops, by the way. Like this should usually not be a problem at all for VRR. But when I switch over to the VRR view here that I recorded with the 240 Hertz camera, you can see that as the camera moves and pans, and I get to that area where it drops to 110, 114, it judders. And it judders pretty intensely, much more than you would imagine that such a small frame rate drop would do or incur. So yeah, even with a small frame rate drop like that, VRR is most definitely not working in the way we expect to. You should not see judder at all with VRR enabled, especially for drops like this. And it's really bad because this will affect the PC version as well. It affects all Xbox versions, and all these issues that I talked about with like frame rate caps and, performance on Series S not being so great always in the 120 FPS mode. Well, you would usually say with Xbox, yeah, turn on that VRR. It's going to lead to a much better experience. Well, it doesn't do anything here. And this is an issue that they really need to fix because, it's like a core part of the Xbox model.
Yeah, because the 120 Hertz mode is actually almost great. Right? You do get to 120 a lot of the time on Series X, but when you're outdoor in the open world, it just doesn't feel as smooth as it should, and I always end up disabling it for that reason. And it's the only game that has this problem. So I really hope they can actually solve this in the future, because I've been wanting to replay this game from start to finish, and I do think it's in a pretty good place now if you're playing at 60 FPS on the Series X, but there's definitely still some things that they need to correct here. At the same time, it's kind of funny to see all this frame pacing stuff still sitting in here, in the sense that this is actually a problem that goes back to Halo 3. Halo 3 is the first game that I ever really noticed incorrect frame pacing. At the time though, we didn't know what it was, right? This was before the discussion of like things like microstutter with SLI setups in the PC. People knew it was not right, but there wasn't actually like evidence or understanding of frame times yet in 2007, right? It's not something that had been really discovered, if you will. And so I remember Halo 3 having that problem, and it was pretty severe, and everybody thought I was crazy. And that turned out to be the problem. And Bungie actually had this issue for a while, even up through the initial release of Destiny 1, but they fixed it.
Yeah, they did.
It will be under our control. Humanity will cower before your legacy.
That's kind of Halo Infinite then in its new mode, and you know, I'm happy that it's being updated in this way. I mean, what were your final thoughts on this current situation?
I'm really happy to see them fix the things that honestly we are the ones who are really harping on constantly about especially the the cinematics looking wrong, and originally the gun animations also looking really wrong. So them fixing those things makes me think they are listening to their audience. But I would really like to see the frame capping being done better and VRR being fixed. And in general, I think the 30 FPS mode on Series X really doesn't make any sense at all. What they should have done is, if they wanted to make a mode for people that want to play the game with a higher visual resolution, they should have made a 40 FPS mode, actually.
I agree. Well, it would have had the same frame pacing issues.
I know that, but it would have at least maybe felt better to play.
I think 30 could work in this game if they added some really nice per pixel motion blur, which I know not everybody loves it, but I think it would look so good in this game. And honestly, I think if the developers are watching, we do love this game. The core game is good, but there's just these types of issues that we would really love to see solved, to finally get it over the top, so to speak.
Oh yeah.
And hopefully we'll get there.
I hope so too, but that's all I can really talk about Halo Infinite today on Xbox Series X, S, and PC, so I hope you did enjoy this video, and if you did like it, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help us out, support us on Patreon to get years worth of our content in high quality for download. And as always, write a comment below, follow on Twitter, and this is Alex saying Auf Wiedersehen und
I have rung the bell.
Find this weapon.